My name is Charlie Sasscer. As Sarah said, I work in Prince George's County as an ag marketing extension educator. A little bit of background: I went to Oklahoma State for my bachelor's in animal science, and then grad school at Kansas State. And my work was with limit feeding. All the trials, cattle trials that I did for cattle nutrition was we utilized limit feeding. So just gonna jump right in on what is limit feeding. Limit feeding is providing less total feed than what the animal is capable of consuming in terms of energy or gastrointestinal fill. That basically means that cattle normally, if given all that they would desire, they would either eat until they have no more room left or until they are satiated with their amount of energy that they need. So if they're on a really high concentrate diet, they're not going to eat pounds and pounds of it, until they're full. It'll more be until they have more than enough energy for what they want to consume. So when we restrict the amount of intake that the cattle have, we're slowing down the rate of passage in the gut of the animal. And in doing that, we allow the ruminant microbes to better digest the feedstuffs. So essentially, when we provide their entire meal once a day and they consume that, say, within 4 hours, they then have 20 hours to digest that, instead of if we were feeding 2 or even 3 times a day, a lot more feed, and you're really kind of just pushing it through the tract as fast as they can take it in, masticate it. The microbes can get a little bit out of it, and then it passes out. We're really slowing that process down and allowing them to more efficiently utilize the feed. And when we limit feed, it can be done with low energy diets, but when we're doing it with growing cattle or finishing cattle, we're more using a concentrate, a high energy, very dense diet, because we're feeding less of it. So the little analogy that I like to use with limit feeding is, if you think about cars, our gasoline combustible engines, we're both going from a E87 to a E93, just your regular gasoline, to more of a premium. That would be on our feed side. So if you think about, we're not just feeding just bulk prairie hay, we're feeding, more of the good stuff, more of corn. So, we're changing what goes into the engine. And if the cow is our engine, what we're doing is we're making it a more efficient engine. So we're going from a 454 big block to an EcoBoost. It's still in the same body, same body of a cow, but through our management, we're making the fuel that goes in more efficient, to get us further down the road with less. And we're going to dive into how much more efficient is that. So that's my little analogy that I like to use with limit feeding. So we're going to go over all kinds of different perks of limit feeding. So the first one is going to be that it's a lot easier to manage the bunk. So I made a little mock graph here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. If you were feeding cattle on an ad lib diet, their intake is kind of a cyclic nature. So you'd build them up on feed, and then say you'd have a rainstorm or something, they'd kind of bed down, and they would drop off the feed. And then you would build them back up, and this is pounds of dry matter per day. They eat more and more over time, and then maybe you fed them a little bit too much. You had some acidosis or something. Then they would drop off again. So when you're feeding just a pen of cattle as much as they can eat, you're always trying to match what the cattle want to eat with how much you provide. So you really have to have an expert eye to be able to look in a feed bunk and estimate what's left, how much you should feed them if you're trying to, maximize their intake. With limit feeding, it's just flat across the board. It would just be a straight line on here. You're going to feed them, they'd eat more than you're giving them. So it's just flat across the board. You don't have to have any expertise, no bunk breeding, anything like that. It's just a flat 2%, 2.2%, whichever across the day. And we'll kind of dive into some perks of that in a few slides. So as you would expect, you're gonna have decreased feed costs. Obviously, if you're feeding the cattle less, that means less feed going into them. So usually, if you were feeding ad libitum, as much as calves would eat, small growing calves, 5 to 7, 800 pounds, or even less than that, really. They're probably going to consume 2.5 to 3% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. When we limit feed, we restrict them down to, we kind of target usually anywhere from 1.8 to 2.2%. You can go lower. I found that out the hard way, that you can feed them less and just maintain them. But really we like to shoot for 2 to 2.2%. That's usually a good target for achieving a pretty modest gain, 2 pounds a day, depending on the cattle. We see pretty significant improvements in feed efficiency. So as I mentioned before, they're having the microbes in the cattle, they're having a better opportunity to get at that feed stuff and digest it more fully. So we can really see some, truly amazing improvements in feed efficiency. Depending on the study, it can be up to 40%. Which if you think about, your bottom line, how many pounds you're putting on the cattle for, what you put into them, that can be a major cost savings for your bottom line. I also like to comment on usually, what kind of growth we're seeing. If you really pack the feed to small calves, you're going to get a lot of fat deposition. When you limit feed cattle, you're generally it's generally a higher protein diet, so you're really building that frame and muscle, which if you're strictly a stocker or operator, or you're in the growth phase, you're not in the finishing phase, that's a lot more desirable type of growth, because the people that are in the finishing phase, they want to be the ones to put the fat on those cattle. So feeding this way is very beneficial and favored when you go to send those cattle down to the next yard. It's also good to know that it's an easier transition to a finishing diet, because essentially you are feeding a high energy finishing diet, just in limited quantities. So when they go to the feedlot, you're not adapting them to a high energy diet. You're just going from, say, that 2.2% up to, say, 2.5. So it's not, it's a much easier transition to get those cattle onto a finishing diet. And it is also, we do see some compensatory gain when you go from a restricted limit fed diet to an ad lim diet. It is possible to limit feed all the way through the finishing phase. That's a completely different topic that we could go over. But that's just another kind of thing. If you tell somebody that you limit fed their cattle, they're probably going to be a little bit more interested in buying them from you, because they're going to see some compensatory gain. I would argue you should finish your own cattle for that. That way you get to take advantage, you get to experience that compensatory gain. But again, that's a different management consideration. So all of the research that has been done shows that there's no negative health effects. And limit feeding is actually useful in mitigating the risk of self-inflicted potential digestion-related health issues, because you're restricting the animal's ability to overconsume an energy-dense diet. I include this picture of a pretty loose cattle stool, because one thing to consider when we are feeding very highly digestible diets, high in corn byproducts, you might see a lot of these, I don't want to call them pats, more puddles out in the feedlot. Normally you would think, oh, well, that's starting to look like the cattle are getting acidotic. But you also have to consider you're putting in, a very, very digestible fiber feed. And so you can't really expect to have a big, bulky, clumpy manure pat that comes out. But again, feeding them, whether it's high starch or high digestible fiber, you are decreasing your chances that you're going to see any amount of acidosis or bloat. And as we mentioned, so traditionally, a lot of the research that's been done, with my master's and really over the last couple of years, we've really highlighted that it's most beneficial to do limit feeding with high corn byproduct inclusion. But that's not absolute. Limit feeding has been around since the 80s. Back then they did it with, corn. We didn't really have the ethanol industry back then. And as I've moved home and I've done some myself, it is possible to do. It just takes a little bit more management, and but it's the same concept of feeding a very energy dense diet in limited quantities. Still kind of on the health aspect. I can't see my bottom slide here. So with limit feeding, those cattle are essentially, they're always a little bit hungry. So when you drive around, come with the feed bucket, drive around with the mixer wagon, whatever it is, those cattle are usually going to be, alert at the feed bunk, ready to be fed. So this provides us a really good opportunity, for morbidity detection, especially in, stress, lightweight, newly received calves where, we're probably fighting some bovine respiratory disease or other ailments, if they came through a sale barn, whatever it may be. It's usually a pretty good indicator that if there's, a calf at the back of the pen is not up at the bunk line eating, you should probably go check that calf. So that's, again, with high stress or, high stress, potentially sick cattle, limit feeding provides you an advantage in detecting sickness. Another cost that we don't often consider with any of our cattle operations is the waste removal. For a small operation, just a few head, you might not notice, switching from ad lib to limit feeding, it's, say if it's still a skid steer bucket either way. But on a large operation, we can see a decrease in waste removal as much as 35 to 43%. So in a large operation, that can be a pretty significant amount of waste that you have to haul out using big equipment and loaders. So there's a lot of things to consider with limit feeding. So first off, as I mentioned, this is a much more energy dense diet. So if time and equipment wear is important to you, as it should be for a lot of producers, feeding a very energy dense, concentrate dense diet versus a fluffy hay ration, you're gonna be able to get a lot more onto a mixer wagon than feeding hay. So that could, if you're feeding a lot of cattle, you could be going from 3 loads a day to feed down to 2. You also are feeding a lower level of a bulky forage, which results in saving and handling and storage. If you think, all of the big feedlots out west, they only include 10% of the diet as a forage, as little as possible, because while we may be able to grow and raise a lot of hay here, if you think about it, it's a very energy not dense, versus corn. You have a lot of waste if you have to process it. You need a lot of infrastructure to store it inside to keep it good, to keep it from getting rained on. So it's really not an ideal feed stuff to large operations. So when we only feed, maybe 15, 25% of the diet as a roughage, we can really cut down on the amount that we have to, keep in stock, bring in on trucks, all of that stuff. So that's a huge cost saving, feeding less roughage in the diet, and especially in drought years. The price of hay, forage, roughage, whatever it may be, can get pretty expensive. And then a final comment on the roughage. The greater amount of roughage that you have in your diet, the more heat of fermentation you're going to get. So in the summer, you can have a slight advantage, maybe not anything measurable, but it is a little bit less heat stress, a little bit less that they're generating, a little bit less that they have to dissipate from feeding a diet that has less roughage in it. And then another point, a lot of research, some of the research that I did, some of the research before me, we've proven time and again that you can feed whole corn instead of dry rolled corn or ground corn, any kind of processed corn, and you can achieve similar performance. So, whatever that cost may be to, take it to the feed mill, have them run it through a dry roller or own a grinder, whatever it may be, you can skip that with young cattle because they have enough enamel on their teeth that when they remasticate that, they can actually break the kernels open, allowing the microbes to get to that starch. And in a year like this, personally, where corn is super expensive, I might run it through there anyways because your cost of processing in relation to the cost of the corn itself is that's way different than when we had $3 or $4 corn. But that's an economics consideration versus just saying that the science has shown, study trial and trial again, we have shown you can get the same performance by not processing your corn. So facility considerations. This is not the same kind of feeding management that most people do. So you have some things you need to consider with this. First off, I mentioned before, the cattle, they're going to consume their entire diet probably within 4 hours, maybe even less, depending on exactly what you're feeding. So everybody has to be able to get up to the bunk at once. If you are feeding ad lib where the cattle, half of them could eat and then go lay down, and the other half, they'd be able to get up, you might be able to have about 12 inches per head. But with limit feeding, where everybody needs to have an equal chance to come up and eat at once, you need more bunk space. So that's going to result in less calves per pen. The cattle are going to try to push out of the pens. You can't have a weak pen, made of pallets and baling twine, because, they're going to try to push out, they're going to try to stick their head through a fence, because again, they're going to have that really healthy appetite. The bullet point says they'll try to roll each other out of the bunk line. That's not a mean thing that they do to each other. It's more of they're all standing at the bunk line, and as you're pulling by with the tractor, they're kind of following it down. And if one of those calves gets turned and the rest keep pushing, they'll end up rolling that calf into the pen or, up into your bunk line. So it's just something you have to consider that you normally wouldn't see if you weren't doing this kind of management. This practice, if you're going to limit feed, it needs to be in a dry lot only. It can't be in a grass trap. You have to be providing the entire diet. Because again, with them being hungry, if they go out, and first off, they're gonna eat whatever grass, weed, or whatever it is down to the ground, and then that's going to, essentially mess up, the system that we have going within the cattle. So there needs to be no pasture, no trees. It has to be in just a dirt surface lot. And a lot of that, it's not that they're starving or hungry. They think they're hungry, but a lot of it would be out of boredom. Again, if they eat everything for 4 hours, and then they have 20 hours with nothing to do, and cattle are used to being active all day. As I've said several times, the diet is consumed within 4 hours, so that's very beneficial when you think about if you have any. You don't ever have to really clean a bunk. So, a large operation, any amount of spoiled feed, they would have to either hire somebody to shovel that out, or they make implements to, either paddles to sweep it out or to blow it out, big blowers. But with limit feeding, the cattle, they eat that feed so fast, there's never anything in the bunk. So if you have a rain event, if you get 4 inches in 24 hours, you don't have a puddle there that you have to kind of a soupy mix that you have to shovel out. They've eaten their feed as soon as it came in, so you have just a lot less spoilage with limit feeding. And then with that, consuming their entire diet within 4 hours, that opens up the opportunity actually for a research project that I did where we called it bunk line sharing. So that's a discussion for another day, but essentially, if you think about it, you could have multiple groups of cattle and rotate them into your feeding pen, wherever you have your concrete apron, your bunk line, you could have multiple groups of cattle utilize that bunk line. So really maximizing your fixed asset, which would be your bunk line, over as many head as possible, because again, those calves only need it for 4 hours of the day, and there's 24 hours of the day. So just a little a video. So that was a heifer that I had. I had 2 pens in my barn, and in order to limit feed one side, I had to block off the hay rack, because the other side was finishing steers, and they had ad lib hay. And I thought I did a pretty good job of blocking off that hay line. So I was controlling the only feed that they got. And that heifer, she was tall as a giraffe, and she decided she was hungry and she was going to jump up and grab a mouthful. So again, just a consideration that your facilities they have to be different. They have to be pretty solid if you're going to implement something like limit feeding. And then one final consideration on facilities with limit feeding, because you're feeding very much to the T, 2.2%. Those cattle, they need to be weighed weekly or bi-weekly, because obviously they're going to grow. So you need to be keeping up with making sure you're at that 2%. So if you're just doing a few head, you need a scale. If you're a big operation, you kind of need pen scales, and you also need the time and the labor to weigh those cattle. That way you're keeping them at the 2.2% of their body weight. So with limit feeding, it kind of opens up the door for something that we call program feeding. So program feeding is achieving a specific gains during the growing phase or early in the feeding period. So I'm going to have an example here on the side. But if you use, price prediction forecast, I like to use beefbasis.com. It really, you can utilize limit feeding to hit certain weight and market goals. So hopefully that'll make sense with our little example here. So a lot of us, this time of year with weaning, say you have a 500-pound calf in October, and you use a price prediction forecast, you forward contract, whatever it is, and you come up with, you can sell a 600-pound calf for $1.40 or 140 100 weight on November 20th, which is 50 days. So the sale price of that calf is going to be $840. Say your cost of gain is 80 cents. Your sale price minus your gain is going to be $760. And that's shooting 2 pounds a day, which is a lot of times, what I try to go for with limit feeding. So that's beneficial, because on the contrary, say you just wanted to ad lib feed, and the price for that, a 700-pound calf, you're not restricting at all. You're going to push them. I think this is 3 pounds a day. Yeah, three pounds a day. Say you want them to gain 3 pounds a day for 67 days. Well, your return for a 700-pound calf, say that calf's not as desirable. So the market's only going to give you 120 100 weight on December 7th. Again, that's 3 pounds a day for 67 days. That'll put you at a 700-pound calf. Well, there you're still only going to get 840 pounds or $840 for that, but your cost of gain still at 80 cents to put that weight on. You're going to end up with less money. So with limit feeding, target program feeding, it gives you the opportunity to use market forecast and hit certain markets, hit times of the year when maybe a lighter calf is more desirable, but you'll shoot past that goal if you just feed them all that they could eat. So it's kind of a tool to maximize your efficiency. So kind of how I use this, I don't sell cattle at the sale barns, but I use this because I custom finish beef, and you have to schedule these slaughter appointments. I mean, sometimes a year in advance. So you're then backing up and say, well, I have a a 500-pound calf now, and in 365 days from now, I want him to be 1,400 pounds. You kind of have to really, systematically plan out to where, you're not going to be finished a month early, and then you're just, pumping corn into them, and, they kind of get stale, or maybe they're underweight. So with limit feeding, I utilize it to, maybe grow them slower at first. And then, once I, get that frame, get their frame developed, get the muscle on, then maybe when I get to my last 5 months, then I'll pack the finish on. So it's limit feeding. It's a tool for when you're trying to hit specific weight goals. And again, with the hopes of maximizing your profitability. So staying on the topic of carcass effects. So it depends on what study you look at, but there is no decrease in quality grades. If anything, there's quite the improvement in quality grades. The research says, again, some of them say there's no difference. Some of them say there's a little bit. The people that I know that are doing this, commercially, putting this into practice, they see huge improvements in quality grades. And we haven't quite narrowed down, what is the science behind, why is that happening? What is it about, making, having them hungry for 90, 100 days and then giving them full feed, what is it changing about their metabolism? But there's something there that results in it. My theory is that I'll go into the next point. So with limit feeding, if you slow grow them at first, you're essentially they're going to be a little bit older, because instead of gaining at 3 pounds a day, say you're hold them at 2. So they're going to be older at the time of slaughter. And that can be very beneficial when you consider that there is an age component to marbling ability. 18-month-old steer is just going to have a greater ability to marble than a 12-month-old steer. That's just kind of how it is. So if there's a way that we can slow grow those cattle, get them to that more that age in their life when they're more prone to marble, that can really put money in our pockets with receiving a premium for a quality grade. My theory behind this is, why do we see such a increase? I think it's because you're starting at a young age, providing very concentrated diets. So, you have to provide the energy if you want them to marble, on top of you're doing it for a longer period of time. So that's more time in the animal's life that they get to slowly deposit that intramuscular fat. Whether or not that's proven, there's more science, more people looking into the more science behind it, but there's, regardless of that, there is generally improvements in your quality grades. So I just have 2 slides here on what does this look like as far as your diets. So this is a OSU extension. This is a little Excel program from my alma mater school that you can use to balance diets. And I would say if you're going to do this, you really need to balance diets because again, you're feeding less than what they would take or normally intake. So you need to make sure that what you're feeding is balanced for that decreased intake. So a lot going on here. If you look over on the left, this is just what you're what's going on, or what's going into the cattle. So this is actually the diet from my research trials that I did in grad school. Just 11% hay or grass hay, 11% fescue, rolled corn, 40%, so very high in distillers. And then we fed a commercial pelleted supplement, but just for simplicity, I just put in limestone to balance your calcium phosphorus ratio. And I'm sure you can look down here where it says your projected average daily gain is only 1.28. But I would argue that's kind of the limitations of, the program only knows, the values you're putting into it. And, it's using just kind of stock values for your, what is your feed stuff. But just wanted to show, kind of a breakdown of a tool you can use. You could certainly hire a nutritionist that would be have a much more sophisticated software to do this. But this is just what I use. So the next slide, this is actually kind of more of what it looks like when I do this, because I don't, and I would imagine most of you don't have access to corn byproducts, whether that be a corn gluten feed or a distiller's grain. So what I'll feed is a little bit higher hay, just for to help peace of mind, feel better, not cause acidosis. So I shoot for usually about 25% of the diet to be a roughage. And then mostly corn grain, as we said before, that can be whole corn. This year, if I was doing this, I would be feeding ground corn. In order to meet my protein requirements, feed a little bit of soybean meal, just a little. This is a little as you possibly need, because that's a very expensive feed stuff. I actually utilize urea as well, because it's way cheaper, and where you're feeding so much corn, you can use urea. And then just to balance your calcium phosphorus ratio, limestone, and then to make this program happy, I will usually every now and then I'll give them a little bit of a free choice mineral to balance all of the other micro minerals, and hopefully Sarah isn't shaking her head at that. But I don't worry too much about that other stuff, especially when you provide a free choice. And again, this program estimates, you're only going to get 1.39. I would argue, I think you'd get much better performance out of that. But really kind of doing this trial and error is the best way to come up with, what rate should you feed at, how much corn can you get away with without, being too much. But kind of, starting with a calculator, and then, tweaking how you're feeding is really the best way to approach this, in my opinion. So just a final takeaway. This is my slogan. I think a lot of my friends might tell you they're probably going to put this on my headstone. You can't manage what you don't measure. So whether it's deciding if this is a competitive way to feed, or tracking your gains, deciding if it's working or not, you need to measure stuff. You need to measure how much feed is going into the cattle, how much gain you're getting out. If it's a significant cost, you can measure how many skid loader buckets of manure you have to haul out there. I'm not to that point. I mainly just measure my feed to gain, or my cost of gain and my feed to gain, to determine, are these cattle more efficient, more profitable. But especially with limit feeding, where again it's kind of playing with fire in a controlled reaction. You do need to measure your inputs, and you need to be very precise about what you're feeding, the time of day that you're feeding, all of that. So with that, if there's any questions, hopefully I didn't lose you all too bad.